good evening. I'm Brian Reagan. This is
Tyler Kelly.
And we welcome you to our Twilight Talks on Abraham. And we are in Genesis chapter 17. And Tyler, if you will, go on ahead and just read verses 1 through 10.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant was with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised.
All right. So, God is moving into this place. As you look at this, he's saying, I will establish my covenant. One of the things that we sometimes don't give Abram credit for is the fact he's still around 25 years later. You say, well, God is faithful. Yeah, okay, God's faithful because you're looking backwards and you know where Abram's story goes now that he is Abraham. That's a different lesson for a different day, the placement of the ch in his name. But if you're Abram, 24 years since you left Haran, after the death of your father with your nephew and your wife and some possessions. And here you are that you are mighty in war. You are an economic powerhouse by yourself. Kings cut treaties with you now. Very different scenario. And he's been blessed, but he still doesn't have a kid from Sarai. And there's a point, as this dialogue will continue, where Abram will say, now that he's Abraham, he'll say, oh, that Ishmael would live before you. He's like, man, just use Ishmael. Just use Ishmael. Okay? And the Lord's like, no. Because God has been protecting this for Sarah all along. Remember when they went into Egypt, what happened? God brought curse on the house of Pharaoh for the sake of Sarai. And oddly enough, what we're going to see in this as it moves forward, God is going to end up cursing Abimelech because of what is going to happen. Abraham gets squirrely sometimes, y'all. And he's going to have this event with God. Then the stuff with Sodom and Gomorrah is going to happen. Then some other stuff is going to take place. Abraham gets squirrely for a split second here. But he doesn't quit. He doesn't quit. Do you have some thoughts on all this, my brother?
No, sir.
You sure?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I haven't taken everything. But notice what he says, verse 9. He says, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. That this had to look forward to faith, like is talked about in Galatians 3, Because the simple truth is, there are plenty of people who are Jewish that do not keep the covenant of Moses, let alone the covenant of Abraham. And so this was looking forward to that remnant among the descendants of Abraham who would keep the covenant, but more fully to the time when the covenant with Abraham would be opened up to the whole world through the covenant of Jesus Christ. And the fact that everyone in Abraham's household has to be in this covenant, or they're cut off. They have no benefit, they have no blessing. And go over to Colossians 2, Tyler, 10 through about 13, 9 through 13. If you are not in covenant with God, you have nothing. It's that simple. You say, but you've been talking about promise and blessing and oath. That's right. And once God cut and confirmed a covenant with Abraham, God did his side of it years earlier. Now here we are. Abram is 99 years old. When God originally cut that first covenant with him, Ishmael wasn't even born. So we're talking 13, 14 years ago that God cut that. Now he's going to cut this one. And what's the cutting going to involve? The cutting is going to involve the circumcision of the flesh and the shedding of blood by Abraham, that literally and figuratively, Abram will now have skin in the game. Read us the Colossians 1, brother.
11 through 13.
That's close enough, yeah.
In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who has raised you from the dead, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he is made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses.
All right. So the circumcision not made with hands is baptism. The circumcision made with hands is this. But the circumcision not made with hands is called the circumcision of what there, Tyler?
Christ.
The circumcision of Christ. Circumcision being the sign and the entrance into the bindingness of the covenant. So you can confess Jesus as Lord. You can believe Jesus rose from the dead in your heart. But until you confirm that covenant with baptism and the circumcision of Christ, the circumcision not made with hands, the circumcision of the heart, you are not in it. And God says here that everyone who's not circumcised, every male who's not circumcised in his flesh here is cut off from his people because he has broken the covenant. God is a God that's consistent. Hebrews 13:8, do you remember what that says to us, Tyler? It says
about him being the same.
Jesus Christ, yeah. What is it? What does it say?
Same yesterday, today, and forever.
Yesterday, today, and forever. Malachi 3 tells us what? I am the I am that I am, you sons of Jacob. I do not change. These principles continue on. And so the covenant with Abraham that contains all the blessings, promises, and everything else, those things are actually the foundation of that covenant. All of that moves forward toward Christ. And so the circumcision of Christ is baptism. And if you're not circumcised with the circumcision of Christ that we referenced in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, you have no part in God's kingdom. Just like if Abraham would have said, you know what, I'm not circumcising any of my people. In fact, I'm not being circumcised either, God. That would have been Abraham saying, I'm choosing not to continue forward in covenant with you. Refusal to do certain things puts us outside of the fellowship of God. So, He said, no, there's a lot in this 17th chapter. We'll finish up chapter 17 Thursday and Friday. Do you have anything else you want to add on this, my brother?
No, sir.
With that, then, we bid you good evening. Lord willing, we'll see you in the morning.